The story of this common vine begins not in an English garden, but centuries earlier, clinging to sun-warmed stones along the Mediterranean coast. A Greek naturalist named Theophrastus, his fingers stained with earth, carefully documented a plant with dark, waxy leaves that seemed to climb of its own will. He noted how its flexible stems were woven into decorative garlands for festivals and homes, celebrating its evergreen beauty while its roots gripped the ancient mortar. These garlands, however, held a secret within their glossy foliage. The plant produced clusters of small, hard berries that ripened to a deep black-purple hue. Theophrastus observed that while birds sometimes pecked at them, people avoided the fruit entirely. In his writings, he described the berries as not for the table, a cautious note that hinted at an understood, if not fully explained, aversion passed down through generations of growers and weavers. The reason for that caution was locked in the plant's very substance. Within the leaves and those dark berries resided potent chemical compounds called saponins, named for their soap-like ability to create a lather and disrupt cell membranes. For the ancient Greeks who handled the vines, this meant the sap could sometimes raise a stinging redness on the skin, an early physical warning from the plant itself that its beauty was not entirely benign. From the Greek garlands, the ivy's journey continued west. Roman gardeners prized its dark, waxy leaves, training the vines to climb the marble columns of their courtyards. The plant became a symbol of eternal life, its evergreen foliage a defiant splash of colour against the stark white stone, even as winter stripped other gardens bare. But this living ornament held a secret. In autumn, the vines produced clusters of small, black-purple berries. A Roman poet, observing their waxy sheen, penned a warning. He noted they were beautiful to look upon, but he cautioned his readers that these fruits were not for the table, their purpose purely decorative, not nourishing. The warning was specific, yet cryptic. He did not detail the consequences, only the prohibition. For now, the danger remained a poet's intuition, a suspicion born of observation rather than science. The ivy stood, admired and cultivated, its toxic potential acknowledged in verse, but not yet understood in the body. Centuries after the Roman warnings, the dark-leaved vine found a new sanctuary. In the quiet cloisters of medieval European monasteries, monks trained its tendrils across damp stone walls, weaving living tapestries of green against the grey. They valued its evergreen persistence, a symbol of eternal life that clung to sacred architecture through winter's bleakest months. The monks were meticulous herbalists, recording every plant's virtues and vices in illuminated manuscripts. One such herbal, its pages filled with precise illustrations, contained a new, practical note. A brother tending the ivy had crushed its waxy leaves while pruning, and soon after, a fierce, red rash erupted across his hands and forearms. The skin burned and itched for days. This was no ordinary gardener's complaint. The monastic scribe carefully documented the reaction, linking the physical act of handling the broken foliage directly to the painful inflammation. It was an early clinical observation of the plant's defensive chemistry at work, a hidden irritant within the beautiful leaves that adorned their silent, holy walls. The same ivy that clung to monastery walls now adorned the sweeping lawns of 18th century England. Landscape architects, captivated by its dark, glossy foliage, wove it through ornamental gardens as a living tapestry. They trained the vines over stone grottos and up the trunks of ancient oaks, creating picturesque ruins where nature appeared to reclaim man's work. The plant had become a symbol of cultivated wildness, its potential dangers hidden beneath an aesthetic of romantic decay. Amidst this fashion, a botanist bent over his work table, a single sprig of ivy pinned beneath his magnifying glass. His hand moved carefully, tracing the distinctive 5-lobed shape of a leaf for an illustrated folio. He noted the pale veins, the leathery texture, and the way the stem secreted a sticky resin when broken. His published drawing would catalogue the plant with scientific precision, yet his observations extended beyond mere form. In the margins of his notes, the botanist recorded a curious incident from a country estate. A gardener's terrier had scavenged beneath the ornamental ivy, consuming a handful of the dark, clustered berries. Hours later, the animal retched violently, expelling the undigested fruit. The botanist did not understand the chemistry, but he documented the effect. The berries, for all their decorative appeal, provoked a swift and visceral rejection from the canine gut. From the manicured gardens of England, the ivy crossed the Atlantic in the damp soil of wooden crates. By the 1840s, it was taking root in a new world. American nursery catalogues printed on crisp paper began featuring elegant engravings of the vine. They advertised English ivy as the perfect solution for covering bare brick walls, promising a touch of old-world charm with no mention of risk. The catalogues circulated through growing eastern cities, where homeowners sought to soften the hard lines of new industrial architecture. A gardener in Philadelphia, following the instructions, planted the dark-leaved cuttings at the base of a townhouse. He watched the vines begin their slow, determined climb, their tiny rootlets gripping the mortar, completely unaware of the chemistry woven into each glossy leaf. Across the continent, the plant was sold purely for its decorative virtues. No warning label accompanied the shipment. The catalogue copy spoke only of lush, evergreen coverage, of a plant that thrived in shade. The potential for skin irritation, the danger hidden in the dark berries, remained a silent footnote in its botanical history, buried an ocean away from its original cultivators. As the new century dawned, the ivy's decorative journey across continents had ended, but its chemical secrets remained locked within its glossy leaves. In a European laboratory, a chemist ground dried ivy berries into a fine powder. He dissolved the powder in alcohol, then began a slow, methodical process of separation, hunting for the invisible agent behind centuries of rashes and stomach aches. His glass beakers filled with cloudy solutions that frothed when shaken, like a crude, bitter soap. This foaming was the clue. Through repeated crystallization, he isolated a class of compounds that shared this strange property. They were named saponins, from the Latin word for soap, molecules built to penetrate and disrupt the fatty membranes of living cells. The mystery of the harmless-looking vine was solved at a molecular level. These saponins, concentrated in the berries and leaves, were the precise irritants. They explained the gardener's rash, the molecules breaking down skin cells, and the dog's vomiting as the same soap-like action tore at the sensitive lining of the stomach and intestines upon ingestion. By the mid-20th century, the saponins chemists had isolated decades earlier began appearing in medical reports beyond the laboratory. Poison control centers, newly established networks of expertise, started logging calls that traced a familiar pattern back to suburban gardens. One afternoon, a frantic telephone call came in from a family whose backyard was shaded by a dense, decorative ivy. Their dog had been nosing through the fallen leaves beneath the vine, chewing on the dark, clustered berries. Soon, the animal was pawing at its mouth, thick strands of saliva dripping from its jowls, its abdomen visibly tightened with painful cramps. The case file, typed on a fresh sheet of paper, documented these precise symptoms: drooling, gastrointestinal distress, acute discomfort. This was not an isolated incident. The centers cross-referenced similar reports, building a clinical picture. The soap-like saponins, once identified in a flask, were now causing real-world havoc. They irritated the mucous membranes, triggering that excessive salivation, and inflamed the stomach lining, leading to the violent cramping that left the family pet trembling on the kitchen floor. As poison control logs filled with reports of sick pets, the very same ivy was becoming a fixture of living rooms and offices. Its reputation as an air purifier and its lush, trailing vines made it the perfect decorative houseplant for the late 20th century. Millions of pots sat on bookshelves and hung in macrame holders, their dark green leaves seeming utterly benign. Then, a medical journal published a stark photographic study. Page after page showed the same angry pattern, a forearm mottled with crimson patches, the skin raised into tiny, fluid-filled blisters. The caption was clinical, contact dermatitis from handling Hedera helix, but the images told a visceral story of inflammation. The subjects were adults who had simply been pruning or repotting their common ivy. The article connected these rashes directly to the saponins isolated decades earlier. These soap-like compounds, which protected the plant in nature, were now reacting with human skin in suburban homes. The irritation wasn't a rare allergy, it was a predictable chemical response, documented proof that the elegant vine on the coffee table carried the same defensive toxins that had sickened medieval gardeners and family pets. The same saponins that caused rashes on medieval gardeners and sickened Victorian dogs now sat under the sterile lights of a modern laboratory. A toxicologist in a white coat pipetted a clear extract from crushed ivy berries into a petri dish lined with cultured intestinal cells. Within minutes, the orderly membrane of a single cell began to pucker and rupture, its contents spilling out into the surrounding medium. The mechanism was both simple and destructive. Viewed through an electron microscope, the soap-like saponin molecules embedded themselves into the fatty cell walls. They acted like chemical wedges, prying the membrane apart and creating microscopic holes. This breach wasn't a targeted attack, but a wholesale collapse of the cell's basic integrity, explaining the immediate, violent reaction in a living digestive tract. For a child or a pet who mistook the dark berries for fruit, this cellular demolition played out on a massive scale. The saponins ravaged the lining of the stomach and intestines, stripping away the protective mucosal layer. The body's desperate response, cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea, was a violent attempt to flush out the corrosive invader, a direct, painful consequence of a membrane's structural failure. The laboratory findings from the previous decades now flowed directly into the daily operations of modern poison control centers. In a quiet office, a phone rang. An operator answered, her voice calm and practiced, as a concerned voice crackled through the line. A dog owner described her terrier pawing at its mouth, drooling heavily after rooting through the garden border. The operator's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the toxic plant database. She asked about the dog's symptoms, the vomiting, the abdominal tenderness, and then about the garden itself. When the owner mentioned the dark green waxy vines climbing the fence, the operator's screen populated with the entry for Hedera helix. She began relaying first aid instructions, her tone steady against the owner's rising panic. That same database informed the latest edition of a popular gardening guide. On a page listing common climbers, a small, stark warning symbol, a triangle with an exclamation point, now sat beside the illustration of English ivy. The accompanying text clearly stated the risks of saponins to pets and children, a quiet testament to centuries of irritation finally codified into a public caution.